When I started researching today's show on social media, I wasn't sure if it was more of a pox on democracy or just a place for millions to obsess about a 13-year-old pug named Noodles on TikTok. Blaming social media for the state of our broken public square can eclipse the real issues that divide us. But algorithms that keep people hooked on anger, foment violence, and hurt children need to be rebooted. Here to explore how to do that is a distinguished bipartisan panel. George Farmer, CEO of the conservative social media platform Parler. Frances Haugen, former Facebook engineer and activist, best known as the Facebook whistleblower. Lynette Lopez, senior finance editor at Business Insider. And legendary tech journalist and entrepreneur Kara Swisher. It's great to have everybody with us. We're really, really pleased. And I'm going to start with you. I think of you as an entrepreneur, but you've been covering social media sort of since the beginning, right?
Yes.
And in your final column for the New York Times, you hearkened back to your first column for the New York Times 4 years ago, in which you warned that social media had been weaponized, civil discourse had been weaponized, free speech, politics, all weaponized at the hands of Facebook and Twitter, which you called the arms dealer of the digital age.
Right.
So my question to you is, 4 years later, where are we?
I think we now understand a lot about how it works now. And I think one of the things you have to do is think of historically, William Randolph Hearst did just fine with just newspapers, like creating all kinds of different influences, whether you agree with them or not. Mussolini did not need TikTok. Hitler did not need Instagram. I mean, these things have been present. Propaganda has been used throughout centuries against people. My point in that column was that it's not just weaponized, it's become amplified. And the ability to reach individual people directly in a very specific way gives enormous power to the companies that can do that. And so my whole issue in that particular column was that these people who created these inventions didn't understand the consequences of what they were doing, and they sort of grew without thinking about it. There's a really great Paul Coelho quote that says, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. When you invent electricity, you invent the electric chair. And so that's what my point was being, is that this is a very specific new media that needs to be thought about and figured out before we just grow it like crazy. And that was my issue.
I think you called it pernicious kudzu.
Yeah, a little bit.
Right?
Sometimes it's great. It's not to say some of it's not great. It just takes human frailties and also joys and amplifies them in a massive way. And so the problem is still humans, like the enemy is us kind of thing, and how they behave and how gossip works. And anyway, people who are malevolent players can manipulate the system better than any system that's come before that. That's all.
George, I've heard you talk about words that typically tech titans don't use in conjunction with social media. You know what I'm going to say: mercy, forgiveness, grace. What's that about?
Well, I think social media is an unforgiving place if you make it one. And we've got a whole generation of young people who are growing up in an era where they can't be forgiven for mistakes they've made because of what they've put on social media in the past. There's no iteration of human society which has ever lived through something like we're living through now. There's no iteration of human society where young people have had to watch what they're doing so closely when they're young. Inherently, when you're young, you make mistakes. You're foolish. You say stupid things. You do stupid things. But you grow up. You wisen up. You make sensible choices. You make sensible decisions. And you don't necessarily want the mistakes of your past to be those mistakes which define who you are in the current generation. Social media makes that mistake concrete. It makes that mistake almost unforgivable because every generation will now look back and say, well, you said this, or you did this, or you put something online which you now regret. Is that a society which we want to create? Is that the society where people can feel free to express themselves? You then have to basically say, well, at every age, no matter how young you are, when you have social media, you have to watch what you say, you have to watch what you do. That's an impossible ask for any generation. So when I was at Pivot, that's where I actually was quoted saying that, which is that we do need grace. You need mercy, you need forgiveness, you need these characteristics on social media, because otherwise everybody will constantly be being judged to an impossible standard which they can never obtain and uphold. So that's that was the kind of genesis of that conversation. That was where I was coming at from that.
Francis, you were somebody who never wanted to be in the spotlight. You even said that you wouldn't throw a birthday party for yourself because you were that shy. And yet, you went to Facebook thinking that it could be a force for good for the planet, basically, and instead wound up releasing 20,000 documents that went to how Facebook intentionally foments violence, harms children, and divides us. That was a year ago when you came out, and you said all you wanted was for Facebook to do better. Is Facebook doing better?
I came forward because I saw that there were conflicts of interests between Facebook's business model. So the more Facebook gets you to consume, the more ads you view, the more money they make. I saw that there was an inherent tension between the business model and our own well-being. In the intervening year, we've seen a number of new features ship from Facebook that I think at least show that Facebook understands that this is not just a one-way conversation, that when we're trying to weigh off those trade-offs, there needs to be a conversation between both society and the business model. So I'll give you an example. Instagram had almost no, perhaps no parental controls before I came out. But last December, they launched a huge number of parental controls. And since then, they've launched more rounds of parental controls. They could have done that at any point in the last 10 years, but they waited until there was transparency to make those kinds of actions. So I think Facebook is, or for example, Facebook has launched, they've tried to expand the number of languages some of their content moderation systems cover, which is still not acceptable in my mind. But they are trying to be sensitive to some of the issues I brought up around inclusion and making sure that all the languages in the world are treated equally.
I mean, I'm hearing so far actually sort of a sunnier picture than I might have expected to hear. You think they've made progress, Francis?
I think there's meaningful changes that we've seen. I think we're nowhere near close to what we need, which is unless we have transparency, unless we're allowed to see into the algorithms, see into the outputs, the consequences of those choices, we're never going to be able to have civil society hold these companies accountable. But we are seeing that they're acknowledging that they're not the only ones on the playing field.
Lynette, you've been covering this evolution of a revolution, of something that was supposed to change humanity. All of these, it's going to be terrific. It's going to give a voice to the voiceless. And I think we're all still trying to figure out whether it's a driver of society's pathologies and problems. A lot of people think it is, or whether it simply reflects them as a mirror would. What's your top line on where we are right now?
Well, what the internet disrupted about all media was the distribution platform, the way we get our media. And as Kara said, these companies are very good, especially Facebook, at targeting information for the people that are best able to receive it or most willing to continue down that rabbit hole. So do I think that some people who maybe your friends and neighbors and believe all sorts of crazy misinformation or whatever, would they have found that in a world without Facebook, without Twitter? It's unclear. But in the past, that was harder to do. We know that the business model of these companies relies on the society being okay with them having a certain amount of disgusting content on there that they monitor. The question is, for me, as somebody who looks at the business of these companies, is society going to want so much from them, that so much monitoring, that these businesses no longer work anymore? If Frances gets what she wants, and there are moderators from every country on Facebook, can Facebook still survive as a business in that environment, actually taking care of the societies that host it? Is that possible? We don't know that yet.
I want to talk about some of the downside. I mean, because there is darkness involving social media. Yeah. And one of the things you talked about was that there's a danger of using free speech as a fig leaf when you're talking about propagating violence and danger. But basically, you look at January 6th, at the insurrection, mm-hmm. at the driver, at the volume, at 650,000 posts alone talking mm-hmm. about the fraudulent election, stop the steal, that drove people mm-hmm. to the Capitol, and weaponizing free speech writ large.
The business plan is the problem. And I think what's happened is and this is on both sides of the political spectrum, is everyone's screaming about free speech when it's really about privacy. It's about the ability of these companies to take and manipulate people based on their own information, which is really unique. The idea of how much stuff that you all upload to these companies for free. And what I call it is like you're all cheap dates to the internet, essentially. They give you a dating service. Oh my God, I have email. I've got this and that. And they get all your information, which they then monetize. And so one of the things that's happened is while we are screaming at each other on the free speech debate, of which it's so complex. You can't how far does it go? Does it go too far? Instead of focusing on the debate where it should be, which is the business plan, which has never been regulated, which every other industry is regulated, has to do with invasion of privacy. And if we start talking about that, you start to get that's where you see bipartisan efforts going on around manipulating people's information. And I don't find necessarily, now look, there's a lot of malevolent people all over the place. I don't find that they set out to do this, but it works really well when enragement leads to engagement more than anything else. So do cat videos, by the way. So it doesn't matter how you strike it, but enragement really works. And so if it's a business plan based on enragement, that's going to be the byproduct of it. I don't think Facebook's responsible for the January 6th insurrection. It's the people who ran up and had to wander around with Nancy Pelosi's lectern for some reason. You've got to start thinking about the business plan.
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm going to just hallelujah that because I actually find the free speech portion of this discussion exhausting and somewhat irrelevant. These are private companies. They can regulate speech on their platforms however they want to, especially if society is calling a certain kind of speech like harmful. We're, selling drugs on the platform or, these are no-brainer things that the platform is going to try to filter. Okay, but if you're on Facebook and Facebook doesn't want a certain kind of speech, go somewhere else. That's an anti-monopoly problem. Should we have more different social media companies? Yes, that's the answer to that question. But as for how these distribution platforms are being weaponized, they're being weaponized because they know too much about us. And we give that information up freely. And their business model is to take advantage of that and drive us to whatever corner of the internet that the algorithm thinks will make us keep clicking and clicking and clicking. I believe in transparency for algos. I believe in auditing algorithms. And I believe that all that information about where we start and where algos can take us should be out there in the
All right, but you're going utopian instead of, you're talking about things that could be.
Let me give you a good example. I did a very famous interview with the previous CEO of Parler, who got fired after it because he said he said things he shouldn't have said, and then suddenly Jeff Bezos was paying attention and knocked Parler off of all the things. Right. Apple did, Google did. The fact of the matter is, not to defend George, but Facebook was worse. Did they get knocked off? No, they went for the lower hanging fruit. It's easy to knock Parler off. It's about power and money, really. If you start to think about that way, then all the other stuff sort of sorts itself out.
George, so predating your tenure at Parler, Parler was cited for inciting violence and taken down, whereas Facebook wasn't, which begged the question that Kara asked, why did Facebook get away with it? And I know you bill yourself as the premier global free speech. I mean, that's your DNA, is the free speech. How do you feel an obligation to square public interest and public safety with what's on the platform?
Well, firstly, I'm so pleased that I'm sitting with free speech evangelists on the panel. It's just wonderful. Really. I think public safety, public policy, public perception, these are really complicated terms. It's where the whole free speech argument rests upon who says what is what, right? Because at some point you have to make a subjective call on what you're going to let into the public square and what not, right? And every company does it, and we do it, right? But we try and slide the scale to one end of the spectrum and allow as much on the platform as possible, right? You basically are saying, and this is what Section 230, without getting too into the weeds on it, comes down to, is basically the publisher versus platform argument, right? I would like to be a platform. I would not like to be a publisher, right? I would like to say people can freely come to the platform and publish what they want, and we are not going to censor you for saying it, right? We do have guidelines, like every platform. You can't incite violence. You can't threaten, I'm going to go out and kill this person at this date, at this time.
You do have that.
Yes, we have it. You're not allowed pornography. You're not allowed financial doxing. We have guidelines. You have to abide by them, right? The internet, in many ways, is without guidelines. I mean, that is where you can go. If you want to go off and put pornography on the internet, you can. I mean, it's all there, right? You can go and put financial scams on the internet. It's all there. Social media platforms, at some point, have to commit to some kind of policy guidelines, right? And that's what we've committed to.
All right, Francis, at this point, let's turn to you because George mentioned Section 230, which, for those who don't know, is from the Communications Decency Act of 1998,
Yes.
96.
Yes.
Children was, yeah, okay. But how do you feel about Section 230? Do you think what it's saying is that there should be liability, there should be regulation? That's the question. What's your answer?
So when Section 230 was written in 1996, there were almost no what are known as recommendation systems in the world. So Section 230 was written so that if you had a blog, you could have comments on that blog and you would not be held liable for the comments that someone else put on your blog. The idea was that you didn't really have control over people putting that content on there. You were a hoster. You were not the author of that content. Like a newspaper has control over what gets published in their newspaper. And that was what it was meant to protect. It was meant to protect our ability to have conversations online. Today, a huge fraction of what you see every day is not, you don't see it because another human said, I think this is what's most important for you to see. You see it because a platform wrote an algorithm that decided that was what was most important for you. Our attention is not being focused by people, it's being focused by computers. I do not believe we should remove content protections. So right now, 230 says if you have offensive content on there, you are protected, you're a platform. I think that's important. It's almost impossible to run the internet, in my opinion, if you say you cannot have a single piece of violating content. Because AIs, even real life content moderators, are going to let things slip. But what I do think platforms should be held responsible for is if Facebook has 10 versions of itself and it chooses only to let you see the ones that end up showing the most violence, the most misinformation, the most hatred, because it makes you stay on there longer, should they be responsible for having not chosen one that was safer, that had less violence? And so that's the conversation I think we need to be having. Facebook, any social media platform controls its algorithms, just like a publisher controls its content. I think it should be responsible for those choices.
You all seem to be nodding in agreement. Lynette?
This is what I was saying. I don't think that the idea of transparency around algorithms or any accountability around them is utopian. We didn't have companies disclose their public financials until the 1930s in this country. We can have social media companies at least have people go in there, test the algorithms under different, like a stress test, and have some transparency into where certain paths on Facebook lead you and what that means for society. It would be a multidisciplinary kind of audit from sociologists to engineers looking at this algorithm and saying, is this pro-social or is this anti-social? And if you have a certain number of people on your platform, then you should be responsible for guiding those masses to the content that you lead them to, because you're like basically building a road to content. You are the one that is lighting the road, setting the pavement, and deciding where it goes, you as a social media company. So you should be responsible where people end up when they end up at the end of the road.
But what does that look like? I mean, you're saying you don't want to take away the immunity of Section 230.
They'd be sued out of existence.
Then what is the next step? I mean, there are people who would argue you had radio. They regulated it. They did it in the interest of the public good, of the public.
That's correct. So how many laws do you think govern internet companies? Zero.
Right.
Well, I think I have more laws governing me than Facebook has governing them. So I think the issue is, what can we focus in on? Privacy, transparent algorithm. There's all kinds of things. Antitrust, the ability to innovate, just merger and acquisitions. There's all kinds of ways that do not get us into this political partisan discussion, which is basically about the way they do business. And of course, they're the richest people in the world, by the way, FYI. I don't think we've ever had a situation where the 10 most powerful companies and most valuable companies in the world have very little regulation on them. Now, look, Apple has plenty of problems. Let's be clear. There are issues in China, all kinds of things. But you don't suffer that at Apple, right? Because their business plan is about selling you an iPhone, or their business plan is getting them to use your software. They don't need to keep you captured. Same thing with Google in a weird way, not YouTube, but the Google site itself. You don't consider that particularly problematic.
You've made that really clear that this is about the business model and not about free speech. In the meantime, George, there are people concerned about the fact, political scientist Rick Hasen, who wrote a book called Cheap Speech, talking about you're living in a post-truth era. You've got, cheap speech all over the place. And people are really concerned that it's contributing to the demise of the democracy. How concerned are you about what's going on?
I share the same concerns that most of Western civilization share. We share the moral breakdown of society. The hyper-partisanship in America right now is clearly a problem. But how does one regulate that? Again, this comes back to the question of, do I think that we can top-down regulate virtue, right? And that's a false dichotomy, because you obviously can't. To take it back to first principles, what creates a virtuous society? What is social media? Saying that social media is responsible for the breakdown of civilization is a bit like saying a car is responsible for the car accident, right? Clearly not. We as humans get behind the wheel of the car, we drive, we choose what speed we go at. It's the same with all social media participants. We all get online, we all choose what we're going to see, we choose what we want to look at, whether it's cat videos, whether it's, whatever it might be, inflammatory content. So it's up to the individual whether or not they're going to inculcate themselves with a position of virtue.
You're saying it starts with us, is what you're saying.
Of course. It starts with us as a society trying to be better people, right? And if we're trying to be better people offline, then we're going to carry that forward onto online, right? So
Fox News is out here spreading misinformation as much as Facebook. I know you're not going to like that one bit, but there is a lot of it's everywhere. It's on television. You can put propaganda anywhere you want to. Anybody who wants to spread information can. We had these problems in the early days of the radio too. Father Coughlin, very inflammatory. What really shut him up was the fact that the country didn't want to hear that anymore.
This is slightly different because it's the most perfect form of propaganda because very few people are on very low information diets here. Just the way we eat too much sugar, we're on very low information diets. And when this comes through, it has a very different effect than a billboard. If you have a billboard, everybody sees it. This can target individual people. So and then in your case, George, you were talking about this, malevolent players can really game it. And that's really where the difference is. Game it and hide it in ways that aren't possible. And I think that's about management of a business.
Go ahead, Frances.
And it's also very different to say that people are seeking out this information, or that, people have bought tabloids for as long as we've had, yellow journalism. Facebook saw over and over again, and this has been reproduced on other social platforms like TikTok as well, Instagram, that you can start with moderate interests, and the algorithms, just by clicking on the content, will lead you to more extreme interests. So in the case of kids, you can take an account with no friends, no interests. So this is not someone seeking out anorexia content. You can start with content like healthy recipes, healthy eating, and just by clicking on that content and following the hashtags suggested, be taken to pro-anorexia content within 2 weeks. So there's this real question of these systems are not neutral. They're not just mirrors. This is not just latent demand. This is things like product choices, where in the case of January 6th, the top person that invited people to stop the steal groups invited 300,000 people over the course of a week or two, because Facebook set such high threshold limits, because they made product choices that allowed someone, once they were invited to a group, to have that content pushed into their feeds. So this is not just neutral. It's not passive. This is just like in a church, you have it echoes, and that makes us be silent. Architecture matters. It changes how we interact in spaces, and we shouldn't think of that as a passive factor.
No, but you did pull back the curtain, and let's talk about how, because one of the things, even if there isn't conclusive evidence about whether social media is detrimental or deleterious to society and people, in the case of young people, there has been some information that goes to the fact that there are very real dangers for them. And that's one of the things you uncovered. Now, has Facebook knew that it had the power to send a young woman who was looking at some picture of Beyonce or whoever, some impossibly gorgeous creature, off to perhaps a very dark place of pursuing an eating disorder. What could they have done about it? Change the algorithms, change the architecture?
It's one of these questions where, there are specific risk factors where Instagram could easily change these platforms tomorrow and in ways that are not paternalistic, but are emphasizing giving kids choices and respecting their autonomy and their dignity. I'll give you an example. If you have a kid who is already slightly depressed, they're struggling with anxiety, maybe that's manifesting in body image issues. If they're sitting there and doom scrolling at 2 a.m., that's not going to help them get better. In places like China, they do a more authoritarian perspective. They cut off the kids from the internet at 10 o'clock at night. Facebook could be doing things like asking kids, hey, when do you want to go to bed? And for an hour or two before bed, just slowing the app down a little bit, like imperceptibly. Like that code is live on there today to slow down hackers who steal content. They could be using it to help kids go to bed. So my main point when it comes to things like Instagram is that Instagram doesn't want parents to know their kids could be in danger. They don't want kids signing off because they make less money. It's like what Kara said, it's the business model. The point is they have tools, they could do it today, and they choose not to.
All right, so we're back to the fact that the business model is...
Because the other stuff is more sexy to have anybody start yelling about free speech. It's much more, it's like, oh, no, And I think a lot of people who are malevolent players take advantage. I have been censored, putting a thing in when they never shut up, which is really a fascinating thing. And instead of talking about that they don't like to hear this in Silicon Valley, and I understand why they don't, but we're like, older people might get this, but we're Soylent Green is people. Like, I don't know what else, you know what I mean? Or To Serve Man, it's a cookbook. Like, they're not here to help us. They're here to make money.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a strong case to be made that the business model exploits human weakness, right? I mean, that's how it works. I mean, that wherever you are not paying for something, clearly you are the product, right? It must always be the case because the companies have to make money off something, right? So, I mean, not to give a shameless self-promotion, but this is why we do value privacy. This is why we don't sell your data at Parler, right? This is the kind of...
You don't sell the data.
Yeah, this is one of our big pitches, right? And you're seeing a rise of the privacy economy, right? And I think this is something which is very important. Like, you have Proton Mail, which is making, good strides. You have all the VPN networks, which are making big moves. You have, Brave, the browser, DuckDuckGo, obviously, is very well known nowadays. All of these companies are trying to make privacy a pitch, right? In the same way that free speech as a business model was a pitch for a while, and that's kind of become more mainstream now, you now have privacy as a pitch, right? So this is becoming the universe. And eventually, the consumer, right, and really this has to be consumer-driven. This is what I was kind of saying earlier on. It's like you can't regulate all of these things into existence. The best way to provide for a society to regulate itself is to give them more choice, right? Is to provide the consumer with more choice at a base case level so they can say, okay, you know what? I don't like Google selling my data. I don't like Gmail selling my data. If you have a Gmail account, it's free. That's your data, right? So go off and use an account where you're paying for it. Yes, you are paying for it, but you're protecting your rights, right? And this is, I think, the best option personally, because I just don't think that regulating top down, getting the government to step in, because one day those regulations will be used against you somehow, But
there are some basic, privacy, the ability to buy and sell data there's no national privacy bill in this country. There's not.
Yeah. I mean, this is something where the EU and America have vastly different.
And Francis was instrumental in helping get that through. You were over there. Congratulations on that. You did help get through a new set of standards that basically uses an ethic of transparency, which we're often told means, is not the best way to go ahead. But you really were pushing to have that happen in this country. And what are the odds of it happening in this country?
I think transparency is one of those things that people on the right or the left could get behind. No one likes the idea of being manipulated. No one likes the idea of, not knowing what they're not seeing. And one of my big criticisms around content moderation is right now stuff's getting taken down and we have no idea why. And we don't know if it's consistent or not. And one of the things I've heard around the world from activists is the same systems that are meant to protect us, like maybe keep us from hate speech, are being used to take down activists to try to fight against violence against women online or against homophobia online. That because these systems are not done in robust ways, we end up silencing counter speech as much as we silence violence. In the EU, they're taking a stride ahead and saying it's not okay for our information environment to be opaque in these ways. We have to see how these systems work if we want to have democratic oversight of them. And so the DSA is grounded in the idea that researchers and civil society groups must have access to this raw data. If we can't ask our own questions, if we can't proverbially buy a car and crash test it ourselves, if we can't put a sensor on it ourselves, we can't really hold it safe.
George, I want to get back to, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to the children, but put your father hat on because you have a newborn, congratulations, as well as you have another child about to be 1 year old, I think.
Yeah, 1.5. Yeah.
1.5, okay. So the question is, your wife tweeted something to the effect of, there's no 8-year-old on the planet who needs to be on social media. Go color, find a coloring book, right? Now, 8-year-olds, I think, they log like 6 hours a day from the studies that I read on social media, which is a lot of time. Your wife also did point to the fact that she felt that the information that had come out about self-harm and the harms to young girls and young people were real. I mean, that's a done deal as far as she's concerned. Now, in terms of you on your platform, or in terms of you with your children when they get to that age, do you think there should be is there anything that can be done to protect children from that?
Yes, parents have a responsibility towards their children. I mean, this is part of becoming digitally savvy, right? We're in a generational change where parents need to be aware of what their children are doing. You know, of course, it's easy to hand the screen. I mean, we all know that. That's the whole point, right? It's an easy distraction, but is it the right thing to do? I mean, I do find it funny how most of Silicon Valley, most of the tech giants, the guys who run the businesses, are sending their kids to schools where there are no screens, right? And the reason being because they know the damage that is being done to their children, right? So parents have a job. As parents, you're supposed to regulate to some extent what your children are doing, right?
Okay, but I mean, Francis was talking about the architecture and the algorithms being stacked in such a way.
Well, most platforms also do have age restriction, right?
They do. They do have an age restriction?
Some do. They just don't enforce them. Everything is about not enforcing.
Well, this is because there's also this Child Protection Act or law that was brought in 1998 that has no teeth, according to Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar. So why? I mean, everything is sort of out there and not being enforced.
I mean, that's also because in the same way that, for example, Capitol Hill can't regulate crypto, most of the infrastructure, I mean, you've got senators who are octogenarians trying to regulate an industry they don't understand, right? I mean, obviously, this is nonsense. You've got a gerontocracy in America right now where you have, the House and the Senate, the oldest Senate we've ever had in history, trying to regulate crypto and social media. I mean, what a nonsense. I mean, are you kidding me? There's no way they can do this. So
the hearings are painful.
Yeah, they don't even understand what they're doing. So first of all, you need relevant regulation for the current era formed by people who actually understand the industries, not by people who think that Bitcoin, is whatever they think it is. I don't even know what they think it is.
Mark Zuckerberg is the most charming person in the world, but he manages to get through congressional hearings without answering a real question from a real that is actually good and understands the material difficulties and dangers of running Facebook. I have yet to see a congressional hearing where Mark or when Cheryl would go there, where there were good questions. And Francis, what do you think? Have you seen one ever?
If you look at how much progress the Senate has made in terms of even the questions it asks, like back during Mark's last time he was on the stand back in 2018, there was the famous incident where they asked, like, how do you make money? And Mark looked at the senator and said with a straight face, like, we show ads, right? Like there was that level of a gap. And if you look even as recently as a year ago, like when I did my testimony, the Senate was asking really, really good questions. And I think it's one of these things where we are in a time of transition. Part of why I came forward was I believe the public needed information in order to ask the right questions. And we're having very different conversations now than we were even 2 years ago. So Mark hasn't yet, but I think he's going to face the music in the near term, because our regulators, our general public is waking up to the right questions to ask.
Yeah, I would agree with her. I think the Senate's gotten much better. Francis, that was actually a watershed where that was a very good hearing, where there were good questions. It wasn't noisy the way they can be, or stupid, or something like that. And so they've gotten better, and the regulators surely have gotten better. Now, look, Mitch McConnell can't fly a plane, and somehow they managed to regulate the plane industry, or Wall Street. They don't know a lot about Wall Street. Somehow they get it right. Sometimes they get it wrong. Maybe too much affected by the industry or by lobbyists and this and that. But this is an industry that that is, again, the most powerful in the world, and they haven't really gotten their arms around it. They are definitely starting to. But one of the things that I noticed during her hearings was that the general public started to understand it in a lot better way. Also, other tech companies are separating themselves from, one of Apple's branding events is privacy. They make a big, and they're essentially attacking Facebook. Apple right now is the biggest regulator of the internet. Apple and Google are the regulators of the internet, because Apple passed some rules around the iPhone that really hurt Facebook's and Snapchat's business. And as much as I like Tim Cook, I don't want him to be the regulator of the internet. And so that's where it can be done if it's done correctly.
But, that feeds into the consumer choice concept, right? Which is that what I was actually saying was that Apple is drawing a line in the sand compared to Google, right? Whereas Google does not value your privacy, Apple does, right? And this is a big differentiator between the two. If you have a phone, it's either an Apple phone or it's a Google phone. It's the biggest duopoly in the world, right? And so, if conservatives want to break the mold, they have to get a new phone, right? Because I've said this many times before, until you can break out of the two of those, you're really handing the regulation over to those two companies, right? And so, but Apple have drawn this line in the sand and said privacy is important to them. This is why it's affected. Facebook's stock price dropped 10%, 13%, I can't remember what it was on the day, but it was a big drop when they announced their second quarter results, because they said this moderation change or this content change from Apple is going to have a top line revenue effect to the tune of $12 billion in the next quarter, right? And this is a big hit for them.
Yeah, it's amazing watching what Mark Zuckerberg has done in the face of that adversity to his baby, to Facebook, the what used to be the golden goose of social media companies. They're finally seeing declining revenue for the first time this year. And what he's done and how he's responded is to move to the metaverse. He believes in domination. He believes in getting there first, owning the property, and taking over your privacy in that place. So he's moving to the metaverse, not because this is the new hot thing. I don't think any of us are. I'm not going. Are you? I'm not going to the metaverse. I'll go to Mars first. But because it's a place where he doesn't have to deal with regulation, where he can dominate. And instead of going back and making Facebook better, instead of focusing on making that platform pro-social, he's like, let me go to this wild, wild west and stake my claim and make sure that I own this when people get there, so I can determine the rules of the road. Because it looks like the governments and society are coming in voting with their feet and actually passing legislation that harms my business model. And we're starting to see it for the first time now.
See, that's an inevitability, though. You remember when AOL was the biggest thing since sliced bread, right?
Yes.
And so one of the things that's great about technology is eventually you die, right? Like the young eats its old, essentially.
Right.
But what's going to happen is people just aren't using it. That's it.
I have to ask you, because a couple times you've made reference to, you knew when you met Mark Zuckerberg 17 years ago that he had the power to make it go terribly wrong.
Yes, I was worried about that.
Well, you saw signs. What were the signs?
When he told me Augustus Caesar was his hero, that was problematic. I felt that he was representative of a lot of people in Silicon Valley that had no sense of history or consequence. And they lived in a world, if you were there at the time, where they treated them like children, like very smart boys that got whatever they want. Here, have another cookie, essentially, the VCs did. And so you had a group of people that didn't think about consequence of anything they made.
Francis, is what you're hearing Kara talk about resonating with you in terms of sort of the mentality starting at the top of Facebook?
Facebook has understood since the beginning that as long as all we could see was what happened on our screens, that if we couldn't see beyond those screens, that Facebook would continue to do whatever they wanted to do. That they knew that all the interesting choices were being made on servers, they were being made, in Menlo Park, and that if we could only view our experience or our collective experiences just like one screen at a time. And they made a choice. And they made a choice that was different than platforms like Twitter made. Like Twitter from very early on had a fire hose of their content where people could view what is being distributed on Twitter. And Facebook very intentionally has cut off every single chance for us to learn independently about these platforms. And they did it because they wanted unilateral control. When Mark talks about how he wants to be Caesar, Caesar was not known as being like a man of the people, right? Like this is not about an equal and participatory relationship. It's about they know what's best for you, and that's what's going to happen. But the reality is that no system of power can act in a way that is aligned with the public good unless there are those countervailing factors. That we need to have transparency. We need to have our own frame of reference in order to push for the right regulations, the right kinds of ways forward.
Since you're an educator, and I've heard you talk about this, and I think it's important, again, goes back to the humanity of this, which sometimes I think gets bled out of it. Talk about how it's easier to push people in the direction of hatred than to cultivate empathy or compassion. Explain why that's possible.
These algorithms today they use something called engagement-based ranking. That means when they go in there and say, like, is this piece of content better than this piece of content? They have to come up with a mathematical way of describing the goodness of that content so that the computer can take 10,000 pieces, 40,000 pieces every time you open the app and decide what's the first thing to show you. And the way they simplify that down is by saying, if you get more clicks, you get more comments, you get more reshares, that must be better content. And the only challenge with that is that the shortest path to a click is hate. Was it enragement leads to engagement, as Kara said earlier? When you have a system like that where good speech cannot answer bad speech, you begin to have differential forces. So you asked a question earlier, is social media a mirror or is it an amplifier, right? Or is it an inducer? If people begin to see the content that makes up more and more of their feed is angrier, or that the posts that get the most comments, the most likes, are those ones that are hot takes, it trains us that that's the kind of speech that's appropriate for these platforms. They're all interactive cycles. And so I always like to say we don't have a misinformation problem. Like we've always had misinformation. What we have today is an amplification problem or a conversational problem. And those are all the results of intentional architectural design decisions.
It's also addiction. This is an addiction element to it. You cannot
addiction.
Look away from it.
Yeah.
And anyone with kids, anyone with yourself. My kid was using the other day. He goes, "I just have to see one thing." I said, "Everything's on there. Like there's never an end to it." And so there's lots of studies of this, the addictive quality of it, the way they design the buttons, everything else is about that. And it's actually kind of fun. It's kind of like, what's the next thing? What's the next? It's very in tune to the human nature, except that it's always on and it's always there and you're always distracted and you get pieces of information. That's you don't get the whole story.
But you're talking about living in a low information age where people, basically it's sound bites, it's how fast
That's
can you
correct.
be?
It's called snackable, but think about what snacks are. This is not unlike sugar. Sugar tastes delicious. It really does. And there's a human element to loving sugar. Doesn't mean we should be eating it all the time. And so if you have a high sugar environment, you have crazy people, right? As anyone who has children knows.
What do you mean by low information age?
Well, low information diet is what it is what we're getting is Twinkies, or else we're getting pieces of information. And so we can't substantively understand. Every story gets overwrought.
Yeah, because I would say that information, in terms of accessibility to information.
Never had more.
Yeah, exactly. So in theory,
that's correct.
Therefore, we should argue that people have the ability to research and do their own. the basic premise of Western civilization is that human beings are rational and can make rational decisions. If we don't even agree with that premise, then democracy is a farce and an illusion, and we should just abolish it now and replace it with monarchy, right? Because if it doesn't work, then why are we even trying? So we have to rely upon people to make rational decisions, basis information that they can access.
I think these devices make it, there's an element of casino to it. There's that you can't look away. And I think they never, one of the things that's done is nobody ever studies it systemically. Like it's the device, it's the stuff on it, it's the tons of information, it's people feeling disempowered. A lot of it has to do with people feeling that they've been manipulated their whole lives, or they have some grievance. It's got this. And so it's sort of this perfect storm of everything, and it's all in this little device in your hand that you love. I mean, when I had a baby, I had a phone in my hand. That was really bad. But I was texting someone. I was like, I'm having a baby. I know, don't speak to me. I'm a bad parent. But you can't, it is your best friend. Like, it is your thing. It's your comfort.
But that also comes back to an offline decision. You have to have a healthy offline life. You know, it's not just about saying, how can we regulate this and make this suitable? Because if we do that, it will never work. You are trying to top-down impose virtue, and that's why I just think it's.
What I'm saying is, I think you can't put it down. It is so good. It is the most perfect. It's the perfect device.
It makes you hungry.
It makes you hungry.
Makes you hungry. It really. I mean, somebody talked about that in terms of it's changed our brains in a way.
It does.
That it's just never enough. It's like the black hole. It's just never enough. Lynette, at this point, we have to go to, I can't believe it, but solutions, future, what's going to happen. You have been on the record as saying that you think that the tech titans are in trouble, and basically that the party's about to be over and the bubble's about to burst. Why do you, I mean, you read that Meta brought in $29 billion of revenue in the second quarter. I mean, so what could be bad?
You know, as much as Kuwait, if you really want to put it in perspective. But again, these business models are not assured. We are coming at a moment where we're starting to think about what really drives these companies and what it really takes to make a pro-social social media company for millions and millions and millions of people. And I think that some of the decisions that Congress might make, or some of the regulation that's coming down the pipe, will be harmful to giant social media companies like Facebook. I think that we should be having more transparency around the algorithms, how they work, who they target, and where they take those people. I think we're starting to have those conversations too. And I think we need to have conversations about antitrust and how big we let a certain big social media company get so that there's a lack of competition. These are all things that are being discussed. But you are right, George. There's a certain amount of personal restraint that we as a society, when these technologies came to us, we didn't know we would have to exercise. And so I find, it's dangerous for young people to be on social media. We've seen that. I worry about my parents.
Why?
I worry about older people because they're not taught how to read this kind of news. They're not used to being bombarded with this information. They're used to reading newspapers, listening to the radio, watching television. It's not the same format, it's not the same quality, and it's not the same distribution process. So figuring out what is quality news or what is quality information and what is not quality information is something that we as a society are going to have to learn.
I think when you're talking about the solutions that you're talking about, is young people really are a little better on this stuff, I have to say, when you get to Gen Z. I look at my own kids, they're very savvy. My older kids are very, very savvy about this stuff and very discriminating users of it. They're not as easily manipulated. They control it a little more because they've lived it. But I do think our government can do a couple things without, I'm not pro-regulation, but they can encourage innovation. They can encourage smaller players. They can stop big companies from buying up everything and killing off ideas. They can do all kinds of things to get that going, to sort of lean into smaller companies, lean into innovation, where Facebook came from, where Google came from. You know, I was in the garage where Google was found. I remember going there, and they were nobodies, right? And someone else controlled the information at the time. And so I lean, that's where the government can really help, or do private-public partnerships around all kinds of innovation, not picking winners and losers, but creating an environment of capitalism. I'm hoping that with this new generation of entrepreneurs who are focusing on things like climate change tech, healthcare tech, critical things that we need, that we can get better. Silicon Valley is a lot of really smart people working on stupid things, it feels like sometimes.
Okay, well, let me just ask you a final question, then I'm going to go to George, and I'm going to let Francis wrap this up today. But you, again, going back to the column, the first column you wrote about, we thought it was going to, could have changed the world, but now they have all the power, all the money, all the everything. And yet you sound this, maybe it's because you have 2 older children, but you have two children under the age of like 3 or something.
Yes, I have a
With the
lot of
phone in
children.
your hand.
I always joke that lesbians, the only people having this many children are lesbians and evangelicals. But go ahead.
And Catholics.
Catholics, right?
And
That's true.
Catholics.
So you sounded this optimistic note, which was, resistance isn't futile. We can take it back, basically. Right. You really believe that?
Because it's ours. We paid for the internet, by the way. Not the United States taxpayer paid for the internet, the original, the way it started. And of course, it's been innovated all over the world. And so one of the things we forgot that it's ours. It's ours. It's not theirs. And they have managed to take advantage of it on our land and built buildings on it. But it's our land. We can make decisions. We can benefit from it. We can be paid for our information if we want to be. There's all kinds of interesting things that are being talked about.
You are hopeful, obviously.
Except for the climate change thing. So that's why I'm leaning into climate change thing, because it doesn't really matter if Facebook's a problem when the ice caps are melting or whatever. That's the bigger problem.
No, don't go negative on me. It's almost the end, all right?
I won't. Yeah. But I'm saying I'd like to see some new faces who do lean into changing the world in important ways versus us arguing over Mark Zuckerberg. I'm tired of Mark Zuckerberg. Are you tired of Mark?
Me too.
Okay, consensus on that. Yeah. George, what's your last word on this?
I do think creating an environment of capitalism is incredibly important. I mean, that's what's going to drive change. I would also just very briefly say, oil, Standard Oil, which was, the flag bearer for the entire oil industry, was around for years before it got broken up by antitrust and became the Big Seven, right? We are in still the early days of technology. I mean, Facebook really only became a company in 2006. I mean, I remember using it when I was at school and thinking, wow, this is cool. But we're 16, 17 years in, maybe, to this. This is an experiment which we've just begun, right? So let's not all get too negative about everything, saying, well, it's the end of the world, because we're only less than 20 years into this entire experiment. Practical solutions: don't charge your phone by your bed every night. Spend the first hour of your day without your phone. These are easy wins which every consumer on the planet can implement, and they will change your living habits. They will change the way you consume technology.
Do you live that way?
Yeah. I don't look at my phone for the first couple of hours of the day, right? Because that's what you have to do. I mean, there's a very interesting psychologist, he's based in California, Robert Kwok. He's talked about this a lot, and he said, the first half an hour of the day, the last half an hour of the day, this is the alpha state of brain. This is when your brain is the most perceptible to change. We should all try to change our living habits to not consume. Why did I delete Facebook? I deleted Facebook many, many years ago because I was getting out of bed and I was angry in the morning, right? This is the point. If we all just buy into this consistently and our consumer habits don't change and we don't use different companies which value privacy and we don't try and alter our living habits, then nothing will change because the government will never regulate us into promoting this change, right? So we have to do it ourselves. As consumers, have to do it ourselves.
Francis, you're getting the last word, and I hope I'm allowed to tell people that we're going to congratulate you before we sign off because you're on your honeymoon. You just got married.
I am. I did just get married.
Congratulations, and you're like on this show. It's so exciting. Great.
Yeah. We just had our nano moon, so we did a 2-day honeymoon. But I want to really echo the sentiments that people have been saying in the last couple of minutes, which is that we really are at the beginning. And it's incredibly, it can feel overwhelming right now because we are facing new kinds of challenges or they're new to us. But every single time we've invented a new form of of any kind of communication technology, it could have been the printing press, the cheap printing press, which is newspapers, radio, cinema, TV, whatever. It's always very disruptive. And it takes us some time to figure out what does it mean for that technology to live in democracy's house. We are at the beginning of the era of computer-mediated attention. This is a new space, and we shouldn't look at our current confusion or our current, uncertainty around how do we move forward in ways that respect freedom of speech, that respect our most important democratic ideals. Just because it's not obvious to us how to move forward doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to. And so I'm very excited that everyone was here today and that we're having this conversation, because that's how democracy solves problems. We wrestle with these things together. And we need to keep pushing for transparency, because that will give us the information that lets us have these arguments. And we're going to figure out a way through, because that's what we've done every single time before.
In your next life, you could be a therapist, I think. It's like moment of zen. Let's put her voice on tape before we go to sleep. Thank you all.
Why do you think Facebook hired her? She's good at what she does.
It is time to add to the hopefulness that we've just heard by wrapping up our broadcast with something we call a silver lining moment. As the courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people contribute to inspire us, a global social media rally, Stand Up for Ukraine, organized by Global Citizen, raised over $10 billion in aid for refugees displaced by the war. That's just one example of how we can harness social media as a force for good, and it's up to all of us to find others. Again, we're grateful to our amazing all-star panel for joining us, you out there for joining us, originally from the other Washington, Connecticut, now from Litchfield, Connecticut. Until we see you back here next time for Common Ground, I'm Jane Whitney. Take care.